Hello friends, my name is JJ and it is time for one of this channel's most beloved annual traditions, the video in which we figure out what was added to the American cultural canon in the year that just finished. The American cultural canon, just to quickly remind, is the collection of things that remain a well-known and oft-referenced part of American culture for decades after they first appear on the scene. In other words, the cultural canon describes stuff that has some degree of cultural staying power, as opposed to stuff that might briefly influence the culture for a hot minute, but then be promptly forgotten. So that is today's challenge. A lot of stuff happened in 2022, and a lot of it seemed very important at the time. But which 2022 phenomena seems most destined to be remembered for many years to come? Let's get into it. So the first thing that I would say really earned a permanent place in the American cultural consciousness is what they are now calling generative AI. In 2022, we basically witnessed a whole arc in which this stuff gradually went mainstream. It began in the spring when the AI generating app DALL-E Mini took off and social media became flooded with people making and sharing all sorts of absurdist masterpieces like Corgi on the Moon or Big Bird getting sued or whatever. And then in September, the public was given access to the higher end version of DALL-E, the one that DALL-E Mini was an unauthorized knockoff of. This spawned a whole other trend of much nicer looking AI art, but even then, I think that what made the whole thing uniquely culturally significant was how, in the words of one analyst, AI created its own aesthetic that is specific, unusual, and uncanny. In other words, the distinctly deformed and often grotesque pictures of DALL-E Mini and DALL-E Normal helped introduce a stereotype into the public imagination of what AI art looks like that will likely last for a long time to come. The first form that a new technology takes is often the one that has the most cultural staying power. We can think of how even today, things like video game characters or TVs are often depicted in very old-fashioned ways in pop culture, simply because primitive technology tends to be the most recognizable. Thus, I imagine that the whole specific, unusual, and uncanny aesthetic of primitive AI art of the early 2020s will probably long survive as our dominant cliche of it, even as the technology itself gets better. Near the end of the year, everyone started making those portraits with the Lensa app, and outside of the realm of visual art, the AI writing app, ChatGPT, had its own viral moment as well. It's all been very exciting because, initial crappiness of the content notwithstanding, 2022 really did feel like the first time the idea of computers being able to create semi-imaginative stuff for us to our specifications and have it come out semi-decent officially crossed the line from fiction to fact. 2022, of course, also saw a great deal of public discourse about generative AI, with people debating whether it's going to kill jobs or whether it's fundamentally built on intellectual thievery or whether the stuff it creates reflects all sorts of problematic social biases. But for our purposes, what matters most is just that generative AI was the genie that was let out of the bottle this year, and we now have a whole bunch of new visual cliches, terminology, and political arguments associated with it, and will likely continue to for the foreseeable future. Okay, on a completely different track, my second addition to the cultural canon would be the Dobbs decision. So the power of the United States Supreme Court means that many of the most consequential public policy decisions in American history have been made via court rulings, with these rulings, in turn, usually known by the names of the two parties involved in the case, or often just the name of the appellant alone. So for example, just saying names like Brown, Plessy, Dred Scott, or Obergefell is to evoke some of the most consequential changes ever made to American law and society. Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health was, of course, the decision in which the increasingly conservative Supreme Court overturned one of the most iconic progressive rulings in American history, the Roe v. Wade decision of 1973, in which it was found that the US Constitution guaranteed women the legal right to have an abortion if they so chose. Throwing out that nearly 50-year-old precedent provoked a lot of short-term consequences, namely Republican-ruled states passing restrictive new abortion bans, which they were now legally permitted to. But the long-term consequences are still largely uncertain. You know, will this actually do anything to shift Americans' opinions on abortion overall? Will the political parties benefit or suffer as politicians write new abortion laws? How widespread will illegal or underground abortions be, and so on? Those are all very culturally significant questions in their own right, and they are all inseparably tied to a single decision, and thus a single word that will loom large over America for quite a while: Dobbs. By the way, in case you were wondering who Dobbs himself was, it is actually a kind of interesting story because, in contrast to most of the other great iconic rulings of American history, Dobbs was basically just an irrelevant figurehead. The Dobbs case involved an abortion providing clinic in Mississippi suing the Mississippi government for enforcing their restrictive anti-abortion regulations. And in US law, when you sue a specific government agency, the official defendant is usually listed as the highest ranking person in that agency, even if they were not personally involved in any of the actual details of the case. Thus, the abortion clinic officially sued Thomas Dobbs, who was the head of the Mississippi Department of Health at the time, even though, by his own admission, he had nothing to do with writing the abortion policy that his department had to enforce, which was obviously done by the state's elected politicians. All right. And talking of political stuff, my next pick would be the war over Ukraine. But wait, I hear you say, isn't this supposed to be a list of American cultural things? Well, yes, but the war in Ukraine is a good example of how blurry the lines of culture can sometimes be. As a military and humanitarian event, obviously the war, which started in February, is something that primarily affects Ukrainians and Russians. As a cultural phenomenon, however, it has made a quite large and visible impact on America as well. From the very beginning, most Americans sided with the Ukrainians, viewing them as the clear good guys of the conflict and victims of unprovoked aggression by Russia, America's longest-running geopolitical rival. In addition to the enormous amounts of military funding that was offered to Ukraine from the US government, individual Americans across the continent quickly began displaying Ukrainian flags on their property and social media accounts, giving money to Ukrainian charities, and following every twist and turn of the war with rapt attention. Seriously, I have heard more than a few of my YouTuber buddies say that if you want a surefire way to drive up the clicks, just find a way to work in the Ukrainian war. President Zelensky, meanwhile, became one of the most famous and admired men in America, seemingly overnight, even to the point where Zelensky crushes became a well-documented thing. Now, this sort of deep fascination with a foreign military conflict that America isn't even formally participating in isn't entirely without precedent. The Spanish Civil War captured a lot of American attention in the 1930s, even inspiring one of the greatest works of American literature. The Chinese occupation of Tibet, the Civil War in Northern Ireland, and the long-standing conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians would also be good examples of foreign fights that have penetrated American culture in fairly observable ways as well. And as with those conflicts, it is worth noting that Ukraine supporters have been a somewhat divisive force in America as well, though nowhere near as divisive as, say, people who take really strong positions on the Israeli-Palestinian stuff. A certain faction of the American hard right has become much more pro-Russian during the course of this war, and in that sense has helped deepen that side's drift towards Eastern European authoritarianism that has been underway for a while at this point. But I would say it is also true that the ostentatious nature of some Ukraine supporters has probably helped push some more indifferent Americans to regard the whole phenomenon as a bit of an empty LARP or virtue signal, and in that sense has made the cause a bit polarizing as well. Overall, however, my sense is that regardless of how long or short the Ukrainian war lasts, backing Ukraine will probably continue to exist in American culture as a kind of shorthand for a certain kind of enlightened worldliness, and a signal that you support a very American set of foreign policy values in terms of backing democracy over tyranny and so on. Geopolitical heroes and villains tend to have a long life in the American cultural imagination, and I think 2022 is the year that we officially welcomed a new one. Speaking of foreign world leaders, how about King Charles as another pick? Even though America has obviously been out of the British Empire for a while now, American fascination with the British royal family reached new heights in the latter half of the 20th century when basically all of the primary characters became household names. Elizabeth II in particular became so famous and so well known that she became simply the Queen in American culture in much the same way she did in British culture. She became a leading symbol of America's favorite foreign country and closest ally. And I think you could argue that she actually became a bigger pop culture character in the US than she ever did in England, just given traditional English taboos about mocking the crown. But now the Queen is gone, and in her place, America's go-to symbol of foreign royalty will be the King, a somewhat bumbling old man rather than a prim and proper old woman. I mean, you could say that Charles has been a minor figure in American pop culture for decades, but now the spotlight is all his. It is going to be interesting to see how he will be depicted as king in American movies and TV shows and toys and the like, but I have no doubt that he will be. All right, this list is getting pretty foreign and political, so here is a pick for an addition to the American cultural canon that is a bit more traditional: Olivia Rodrigo. Some of you guys got on my case for not including her in my last year list, which was officially the year that much of the world was introduced to her, but I think I can make a better case for her this time around. Olivia began her 2022 winning the Grammy for Best New Artist in April, an award that is often treated as a sort of official coming out in the music industry. She then won Best New Artist at the Billboard Music Awards in May, in addition to their award for Female Artist of the Year. In June, she proceeded to make history when her debut album Sour, which was released in the summer of 2021, officially passed 52 weeks on Billboard's list of the top 10 best-selling albums in the United States. This made Sour the most successful debut album of any artist in 22 years, or if we want to phrase it in the more sensationalistic way her publicist probably prefers, the most successful debut album of the century, nay, millennium. The previous most successful debut album of the millennium was Lady Gaga's The Fame, which was released in 2009 and bounced in and out of the bestseller charts over the next 8 years. Or, in other words, Olivia Rodrigo did in a year what took Lady Gaga almost a decade. So yeah, I don't think you'd be going out on too much of a limb buying Olivia Rodrigo stock at this point. We will be quite literally hearing a lot more from her. Alright, so those would be my top 5 big picks for additions to the American cultural canon. But now let us get into some of the stuff that I consider to be more of edge cases. Things that seem like they might be able to establish a lasting legacy, but my confidence is not quite as high. So I feel like we can say that the COVID-19 pandemic ended in America in 2022, or at least ended as far as government was concerned. In both the US and Canada, 2022 saw basically all remaining restrictions on personal behavior rescinded, and although you will still see some people wearing masks here and there, and health officials will still be quite quick to note that the virus is still very much with us and we shouldn't get complacent, Corona is pretty obviously now firmly in the rearview mirror as far as something to revolve the entirety of society around is concerned. What is a little bit disappointing about all of this, as far as cultural analysis goes, however, is that there isn't really a single symbolic thing that we can tie to the ending of the pandemic. As I discussed in my previous year in review video, the 2021 rollout of the vaccines didn't really neatly correlate with the lifting of restrictions in the way that I think many people expected, but rather the vaccines were just one of several factors that contributed to a rather slow, gradual return to normal living that didn't really conclude until well into the next year. 2022 did see the debut of COVID self-test kits, which which I do think were an important symbol of our new relationship with the virus for a while. But these have sort of faded from the public imagination now that even testing positive isn't really considered that big of a deal anymore. So yeah, I guess basically I just want to acknowledge that 2022 saw the winding down of the pandemic, but I just don't know if there's ever going to be a great symbol of that fact. Maybe it will just be the date 2022 itself as one half of the brackets when people someday write about it in encyclopedias. Wordle, the word guessing game, really seemed to have a huge cultural moment in early 2022, but it is now starting to feel like a bit of a short-lived fad that I'm not sure will have much staying power, in part because I think after you play it for any significant chunk of time, you begin to realize that a huge part of it is just dumb luck. There, I said it. The name Wordle might stay in the public imagination for a while, but the next Sudoku? Probably not. I was thinking about naming the January 6th Commission because it definitely feels like one of the big political events of the year, and certainly something that will be remembered alongside all of the other great, iconic congressional investigatory commissions of years past, like the Warren Commission or the Church Commission. People still remember the Church Commission, right? But I don't know, it also kind of feels like January 6th had its peak cultural moment when it actually happened, and everything that's happened since is just supplementary material. All right, and then there is one other cultural phenomenon that I'm pretty loath to mention, not just because I am unsure of how lasting its influence will be, but also because I personally just find it to be obnoxious beyond words. Andrew Tate. Hello friends, JJ here. I just wanted to freeze frame for a second and note that I wrote and filmed this video before Mr. Tate's recent troubles with the law. So while I don't acknowledge that, hopefully the rest of my analysis is still relevant. I have honestly gone out of my way to avoid learning too much about this guy, just because he seems like such an insufferably self-righteous blowhard. But basically, Andrew Tate is some manner of ex-UFC type guy who has now rebuilt himself as a tough-talking male self-improvement guru. If you've ever watched Joe Rogan interview Jordan Peterson and thought, man, this is a little highbrow for me, well, Andrew Tate is apparently your guy. It certainly feels like he was everywhere this year, and certainly pretty ubiquitous in social media chatter. But it is still pretty unclear to me whether he is, in fact, the next Joe Rogan or Jordan Peterson, or just some complete flash-in-the-pan meme known mostly to the terminally online as opposed to broader American culture. So there you have it, my picks for things that achieved maximum cultural penetration in the year that was. I initially thought that this was a pretty culturally busy year with a lot of stuff in it, but looking back, I kind of feel like it might have been more of a year in which there were just a few big things rather than a lot of little ones. But anyway, you can tell me what you think. Did I miss any blindingly obvious people, events, or media of 2022 that you think are destined to be remembered for ages to come? Let me know in the comments, and I will see you in the new year.